Hello, good afternoon. Welcome to this iConsent final event. And thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Javier Díez Domingo, and I'm the coordinator of this iConsent project. The iConsent project was the product of an H2020 SWOF call entitled The Ethics of Informed Consent in Novel Treatment, including a Gender Perspective. Although informed consent is the pillar of ethics in medical research, several cases with high public coverage, like now vaccines, have awakened the society on the difficulty to optimize the research objectives and the patient's well-being while limiting the potential conflicts of interest. And as the European Commission mentioned, the focus of the project should be on the involvement of patients in translational and in clinical research. The final output of the project was expected to be a set of guidelines that help the clinicians to find practical answers to the challenges presented by the informed consent. As a result of this call, the iConsent Consortium, that consists of members of academia, research organizations, pharma industry, and SMEs, after nearly 4 years of intense work, has developed the guidelines for tailoring the informed consent process in clinical studies that we are to present today in this event. It is now my pleasure to introduce Julia Garcia, iConsent Communication Manager, that will conduct this event. Good afternoon, Julia.
Good afternoon, Javier. Thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you to those who are following the iConsent final event. Today, we are joined by representatives of academia, patient organizations, pharma industry, SMEs, clinical investigators, ethical advisory boards, and policymakers, within others. All here because we have seen a challenge emerging from informed consent processes so far. We ask ourselves if we are being inclusive enough, understandable enough, ethical enough. Today we're here because we want to see what's ahead of us, because we want to move towards the future of informed consent in clinical research. Today, we are proud to present the guidelines for tailoring the informed consent process in clinical studies. What's on today's agenda? Before dealing with the project's final product and to set the tone for the rest of the event, we will enjoy a master lecture on ethical issues of informed consent. Then, we will analyze the relevance and convenience of the guidelines and present its elaboration process. Following this, we will have a summary of the guidelines' main contents and a presentation of other iConsent products. To finish, we will have a final open discussion where topics such as bioethics, law, gender perspective, and multiculturalism will arise. We encourage you all to participate. Remember, this is a unique opportunity where all the actors dealing with informed consent are represented. In this sense, please notice that there is a question and answer box where you can pose your questions. They will be addressed in the final discussion. Now, before starting, we would like to introduce Lisa Dipendale, Policy Officer for the European Commission. She has kindly accepted to give us a quick overview on policy conclusions from iConsent and challenges for the future. We thank her and appreciate that she is joining us on this special day to us.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Lisa Dipendale, Policy Officer for the Research Ethics and Integrity sector of DG Research and Innovation of the European Commission. First of all, I would want to congratulate all consortium partners, experts, and stakeholders who have contributed to this project. In preparation of today, I have read and reread many of the deliverables produced by this project. And there are so many parts, not only the final guidelines, but many documents, such as the analysis on the impact of ICT on health literacy and comprehension of informed consent in different groups, that will help researchers, ethics committees, policymakers, and the research community more widely to inform their work. For projects like iConsent, my role as policy officer is to try and translate the findings of a research project into policy input to inform our work. In the first place, to inform our continuous exercise of improving the ethics appraisal process that we use for all research funded by the framework programs of the European Commission, being Horizon 2020 and the next one, of course, being Horizon Europe, currently launched. Secondly, we try to use these projects to inform the promotion and support of research ethics education and other initiatives throughout Europe and also beyond. Furthermore, projects like iConsent have a very important role to play for facilitating the broader goals of the European Commission and its framework programs Horizon 2020 and Horizon Europe. A key strategic goal is promoting innovative health research, the uptake of novel treatments, and personalized health promotion, disease prevention, diagnosis, treatment, and monitoring. To realize that goal, it is essential that not only funding is available to develop new therapies and applications, but also that researchers and clinicians are supported in the nurturing of social trust, societal trust in science and in innovations in healthcare. And this is something that we can only do by ensuring that they can adhere to the highest standards of ethics and integrity throughout their research. Informed consent has long been a very important instrument for that. But as we know in practice, informed consent does not always manage to realize the ethical values that it is meant to protect, such as human dignity and autonomy. Informed consent has its pitfalls, limitations, especially when it comes to medical information, medical risks, and the uncertainties that come with that. Their personalities, their moral compasses, their vulnerabilities shape how these risks and uncertainties are perceived and are dealt with. For that reason alone, a uniform approach to informed consent might be wanting. Likewise, a general shift in medicine and healthcare towards a more personalized or precise approach, rather than working with the average patient as the norm for clinical research, implies that also our procedures to realize ethical values must work not only for the average patients, but for all groups. The work of iConsent has made it very clear that there is lots of work to do. The first conclusion is that we can do much better. In many instances, informed consent remains very close to the bureaucratic approach focused on obtaining a participant's signature in a research project. This makes it clear that the existing legal and ethical framework setting what informed consent should be is by itself not sufficient. Although it is very clear when consent must be asked and which information has to be provided, it by itself, it does not ensure that it results in meaningful consent. As the iConsent research has reconfirmed, there are many barriers that prevent that, including gender and cross-cultural barriers, differences in health literacy, and socioeconomic inequalities. To address those challenges, iConsent advocates a tailored, intercultural, participatory approach to consent procedures, the designing of consent processes together with study participants, and built-in continuous feedback and communication. Furthermore, iConsent analyzed how innovative strategies, such as the use of digital instruments, videos, animations, interactive tools, and electronic consent procedures can help to achieve that. What I remember from their survey is that it showed that the new approaches to informed consent are generally welcomed by clinicians, the research community as a whole, but are in fact not well known. For clinicians, researchers on the field, a lack of knowledge and also a lack of resources can prevent that they renew their consent practices. Therefore, I see for the policy level some very important tasks. First and foremost, I think we must continue to support the education on new approaches to informed consent. In general, I think it's not through red tape research ethics that we can make a difference. It is by providing education and also by providing materials to researchers that we can enable them to transform consent into an extended process of ongoing communication with research participants, as opposed to a simple information sheet and signature on a form. The second important message that I see for the policy level is that through the framework program, we must see how we can further accelerate the development and the implementation of these new approaches to informed consent, especially for research projects that raise very serious and complex ethical issues and when they involve particularly vulnerable populations. Sometimes it is already the case that ethics and the time needed to properly address ethical issues becomes an entire work package in a research project. And I think, like iConsent showed, to ensure meaningful consent, researchers also need the space to develop that. For example, for organizing participatory approaches to developing consent and information materials. Another challenge I see for policy is that we must not forget that new approaches to informed consent, especially when they also use digital solutions, come with their own challenges. For example, risk related to data protection, protection of privacy, and as the iConsent research also pointed out, the digital divides. Finally, and this, I think, is the low-hanging fruit and therefore very important, we must also build on this project and see that platforms are available to help researchers and clinicians in the design of their consent processes. For example, by providing them with templates, examples of good consent processes, multimedia resources, design strategies, and so forth. The work of iConsent is, of course, focused on the context of translational clinical research, but might also have an impact beyond that. The challenges of ensuring that informed consent is meaningful poses itself in many contexts, for research in other disciplines and in the context of consent for data processing or, for example, for the use of other AI-based applications. Many suggestions and tools that have been developed by iConsent could serve as an inspiration. The key message being that consent and what it requires to be adequate and meaningful is not something to be addressed just in a single form. A conduct of an entire study throughout its entire cycle can be affected by the requirements that informed consent set. And more importantly, better alternatives can and are being developed. Another key message for policy that I see here is that we need to further invest in education in health literacy, as well as in the increasing the public knowledge about the process of clinical research and development. How timely this research project turned out to be in the context of COVID vaccine development. The concern about trust people have in the development process and in the vaccine safety shows that these should not merely be long-term goals, but priorities. To finalize my contribution, I can only emphasize again that the guidelines ready to use for clinical researchers is a very important, key accomplishment for this project. And I really hope that together we can ensure that there is a very wide dissemination of this guideline to start making a difference. Thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you very much, Lisa, for providing the European Commission's perspective on this. Now, we are excited to introduce Professor Van Delden. He is full professor of the Medical Ethics at the University Medical Center of Utrecht University and leads the project on patient and public participation. He served as the chair of the International Bioethics Committee of UNESCO and as the president of the Council of International Organizations of Medical Sciences, the CIOMS. In this sense, he has served as the chair of the work group for the revision of the CIOM Ethicat guidelines, which have served as reference for the development of the iConsent project. Professor Van Delden also a member of iConsent Ethical Advisory Board, will talk about ethical issues in informed consent in today's clinical research. We would like to thank him for accepting our invitation. We are honored to have him here and looking forward to hearing the lecture. Hope you enjoy it.
Okay, hi, I'm Hans van Velde. I'm so happy to be here to be able to give this lecture about informed consent in today's clinical research. Of course, on the special occasion of the finalization of the iConsent project. I was lucky to be able to see that project while it was developing, and I'm very happy with the result of it. For now, I thought it would be a good idea to talk about the idea of informed consent and to put it in today's development in clinical research. And I will also try to illustrate where the iConsent project has really made progress and shown some very interesting suggestions. But at the same time, there will also be gaps, of course, because you can't do everything. So there will also be future work and future projects, who knows? Maybe a little bit about myself and my background. I was trained as a medical doctor. I worked as a nursing home physician, which is a very Dutch thing. Perhaps it's best to say I'm a geriatrician, but I'm also a professor of medical ethics. And actually I'm mainly that. And I work in Utrecht in the Netherlands. Let's get started. Well, of course, informed consent. Informed consent is, I would say, a cornerstone of research ethics. And research ethics, I'm unhappy to say, was born in scandal. You know this. You know that the history of research ethics is filled with scandals. Of course, World War II, I mean, the start of research ethics, of course, is the Nuremberg Code. But also more recently, of course, Tuskegee in the 70s, Guatemala, which was discovered some years ago, but still many things go on that actually are highly problematic. Actually, also today, that's why I put, are maybe the COVID vaccine trials, will they give rise to the birth of a new scandal? This week, we saw the announcement of both the EMA, the European Medicines Agency, and the British variety of that. And they both said that when you produce a vaccine for COVID that tries to hit also the new varieties, the genetic varieties of the virus, then you have to present less research. Well, that's good news, because that means that the vaccine, that the new type of vaccine can be brought to the market sooner. That's good news. But they also said, well, but we do want that vaccine to be tested in vaccine-naive populations. And there you go. Because where do we find vaccine-naive populations? So people who were not vaccinated against COVID before. Exactly, in LMICs. And why are they not vaccinated against COVID in LMICs? Because the rich countries have bought all the vaccines. Is that a scandal? Yes, it is. So again, research ethics really often comes with very problematic examples. And I actually think that we are witnessing one again. If I move to the next slide, then you will understand that all these problematic cases in the history of clinical research, and therefore also of research ethics, have led to the development and the writing of several guidelines. I name a few international guidelines. Of course, there will be national guidelines and regional guidelines, but there are only few international guidelines, the most prominent, of course, being the World Medical Association's Declaration of Helsinki, with its latest revision in 2013. The Council of International Organizations of Medical Sciences also produced a well-known international guideline together with the World Health Organization. And although the Universal Declaration of Bioethics and Human Rights certainly does not only address research ethics. There will be some guidelines within that declaration that actually do concern research. So these are just a few, there will be more, but these are just a few international guidelines for clinical research. And all of these guidelines have a number of issues, certainly, but they have informed consent as their cornerstone. In order to illustrate that position, I just give you the content of the CIOMS guidelines from 2016. And pertinent to the story of today is guideline 9, of course, but also to a certain extent guideline 7, as the iConsent project and the iConsent document really also has a lot to say to engagement and public involvement. So I think it's fair to say that in the history of research ethics, informed consent has played a main role. And that brings us to ask, why exactly do we need to ask informed consent? And I think that's an important question that should not be overlooked. We should not simply start with saying there shall be informed consent. No, we should also know why should there be informed consent, because that will actually inform us on certain conditions of how the process of informed consent should be conceived. Of course, you can point at the principle of respect for autonomy and say a participant, patient, person has a right to know what happens to him. Sure, that's absolutely true. It's also interesting, as Manson at some point suggested, that the informed consent actually creates a waiver of the negative rights. We all have negative rights to be free from assault, for instance. And as soon as I have consented to participate in research, I can no longer hold that that research consisted of an assault because I consented to it. What I find is also very relevant is the Kantian problem. Of course, you know that Kant, in one of his reformulations of the categorical imperative, said you should never use people merely as a means, But using people merely as a means actually happens quite often in research. Researchers are not interested so much in the health of these participants. They are interested in the health of a population. They want to bring the vaccine to the world, sure. But these persons, well, actually, to be honest, you hope that certain incidents will arise, because if no incidents arise, you will also not be able to indicate which condition, the intervention or the control is better. So in research, we actually often use people. And how can we prevent that from using them merely as a means? Well, that's where informed consent comes in again. Informed consent allows us to discuss the research proposal with the participant, the prospective participant, and in a way also motivate that participant to join the research because he wants to, not because the researcher wants to, but because that participant wants to. And that really changes the game, because that really makes that other person entering the research project on his own, let's say, motivation. And that, I would claim, is a great way of preventing that research really boils down to using people merely as a means. Why I'm stressing this, of course, obviously you'll understand, is that that indeed means, as the iConsent document really clearly states, that informed consent should always consist of more than just, let's say, the moving around of information. From the researcher to the participant, what the research entails, and from the participant to the researcher that he consented. That's just information, but there should be a discussion, it should be a process, and I really appreciate how the iConsent document stresses that. I think it's also fair to say that there are two other goals for informed consent. One is, of course, the protection of the participant, but let's face it, it's also the protection of the researcher. And I will get back to that, but I think I've already made it clear that to me, it's clear that even in public health emergencies, such as the one that the world is witnessing now, informed consent does remain of vital importance. So moving to the next slide, I thought it would be good to just state again, and this is really research ethic 101, if you want, the classical idea about informed consent. You'll read this in the famous Beecham and Childers textbook, saying there will be conditions for informed consent, and of course there's the informed part and there's the consent part. Okay, and the conditions, of course, usually are formulated in such a way that they boil down to voluntariness, competency. Informing is about explaining, but also ensuring understanding. That's actually a quote from Helsinki. And consent, of course, is the decision and the authorization by the participant. And again, informed consent is a process that's totally clear. Now, using these three headings, I thought it would be interesting to see how the current clinical research, the way it's done, is actually changing, challenging, and making it necessary to have some important new insights into the way informed consent is conceptualized. When we talk about conditions, I think we should point to nowadays popular idea of co-creation in research. I'll get back to that. When we talk about inform or information, of course, there's the ongoing problem of how to reach understanding and how much understanding is actually needed. There's that thing called epistemic injustice, which I think is also very prevalent in research. There are, of course, continuous debates about the causes of undue influence. And I think the current forms of research have really also introduced new forms of consent. So this is what I intend to talk about. And I start with the first part, of course, and that is that the paradigm in research ethics has been broadened. I think we should say broadened. And maybe the title of this slide is a little bit misleading, as it suggests that we go from one thing to the other and therefore leave the one thing, but that's not true. We, of course, remain focused on protection of the participants. That remains of vital importance. At the same time, I think we all acknowledge that if we keep protecting overly certain groups, those groups will actually never benefit from the research being done. I mean, just check whatever textbook you have on drugs and just pick one drug. It doesn't really matter which one. And it will tell you this drug was not tested on pregnant women. So we have no information on the effect on the woman or the fetus in case you use it while being pregnant. That's a direct result of that protection paradigm. And of course, the same goes to a certain extent for children, for elderly with multiple diseases, and others. As you know, and this is of course well known, but as you know, we pretend that all people are like males who are between 18 and 65, and we just give everyone the drugs that were proven successful for that male group. And that's wrong. It's simply wrong. So we need to do more than just protect. We also need to make sure that other groups are able to profit from research. And that, well, again, maybe I shouldn't have put change here. Maybe I should broaden the perspective, the paradigm, from protection to indeed also participate. And that gets different forms. You can recognize this in the idea of public and patient involvement. You can recognize this idea in the movement for participatory medicine, in claims to promote scientific citizenship. And I must say, the iConsent document clearly also stresses this idea of co-creation. Do with, I believe it's said somewhere, rather than do to, but indeed create a research project with the group that you're trying to enroll in this project is of vital importance, because it will help your research to actually meet the needs of the people that you're doing the research for. So protection, yeah, still relevant, but really co-creation is what is needed as well. And again, I'm very happy with a lot of the suggestions and guidelines and instructions given by the iConsent document in this respect. There's a lot to be learned from the iConsent document there. So after covering this background development, I think it's worthwhile to also take a look at some of the current issues in informing. And I think there are at least three. Of course, there are more, but I would like to say something about these three. There's one ever remaining issue in research ethics that I'm also myself, as a member of the Central Dutch Research Ethics Committee, never really satisfied with, and that is how much information do we want to provide? And the let's say what members of research ethics committees usually do is stress for more information. And empirical research has clearly shown that actually leads to less understanding. So the answer is not, let's put in more information, because by doing so, we're actually blocking understanding. So we need to find new ways. And I'm happy to say that indeed the iConsent document has shown some of these new ways. First of all, co-creation. Again, if you draft a informed consent document together with the participants, the potential participants, representatives of the group amongst whom you want to recruit your participants, then indeed they can help you write in an intelligible way. So co-creation is part of the answer here as well. But also, of course, there are modern technologies, decision aids that can help you bring across the message. There's, of course, always the teach back method. Please tell me, the researcher can say to the participant, please tell me what I've just told you, then I can make sure that I told it correctly and that I made it sufficiently clear. And all these added strategies are necessary because the reality is that understanding is often lacking. That has been shown over and over again. And I applaud the iConsent document for its suggestions in this respect. And I do hope that they will not only be followed, but also will be tested. So I encourage the whole research ethics community to not only follow these suggestions, but also to set up empirical research that will show that following these suggestions from iConsent actually has merit and leads to better understanding. There's an interesting debate going on recently in the American Journal of Bioethics, for instance, about whether or not we really always need comprehensive understanding at the moment of enrollment. I would claim that's not the case. I think some information becomes relevant only later in the research project and could also be provided then. So we could actually move also to more dynamic forms of consent. And also maybe even accept that in some cases, for instance, when there is not much risk in research, that in those cases, a patient would be allowed to say, well, really, I don't care for all that information. I just simply trust you. I will participate and forget a fuss. Only in certain types of research, obviously. Moving to the next issue, I would like to bring in epistemic injustice. It's not a term that you often hear in the discussion of informed consent. It's, as far as I know, absent in the iConsent document. And still, I think, in a way, it's there. Because what we do all the time, as I just explained, is put in more words and more complicated sentences in informed consent documents. And the effect is not only that understanding will diminish, but also that certain people will even understand less than the average. And those are the ones who are not so literate in healthcare. The result is that in the results of research, medical research, actually a bias is prevalent. A bias of, let's say, the answers from health literate people. because the health illiterate people do not really understand what they're asked and simply refuse to participate. And therefore, the problems of some are more in scope, are at least better seen than the problems of others. And that is unjust. And it also has to do with epistemic injustice, because to a certain extent, those who are not literate are not, in a sense, acknowledged for their knowledge-bearing capacity. So again, co-creation, tailored information, indeed also suggested in the iConsent document, and inclusive information, which again makes it necessary to not only write the informed consent document yourself as a researcher, but to do so in co-creation with the participants, and not just the health literate participants, please, but also the ones who have more difficulties in understanding what you're saying. Next issue, and of course, I'm just scratching the surface in many cases, but that's all I can do right now. When it comes to the information part of informed consent, there's always also the matter of undue inducement. And I would say that indeed the current idea of working through learning health systems might actually also be a threat to voluntariness, and therefore maybe also to the consent part of this, but might also be influential in the way that information is appreciated. Let's say the well-known therapeutic misconception might actually be fortified, might be enhanced by learning health systems. In a learning health system, we do not clearly differentiate between research and care, and therefore for the participant who thinks he is taking part in ordinary care, it might not be so clear that that person is actually part of a research enterprise at the same time. So there are new causes of undue influence that should be discussed under this heading. Now, moving to the next slide, I would like to stress that the research enterprise itself is also changing. Whereas in the old days, you could say a clinical research project clearly had a start and an end, and it was often done by clinicians with their patients. And of course, there was also fundamental research, but there was also a clear group of people who would enroll other visible people, and it would, to a certain extent, be rather tangible. And nowadays, of course, we are seeing a lot of infrastructures for tissue and data research. And in these infrastructures, we have a number of problems. And I concentrate here on biobanks as an example only. For instance, you do not have a clear start. Well, maybe you do, but it's the start of the infrastructure, not the start of a research project. And you certainly do not have a clear endpoint, because that infrastructure will remain. You might have a clear start and ending of the secondary project, but that's usually not the moment where you have consent. So that's where broad consent stems from, right? Broad consent, or broad informed consent, as we would like to call it at SIAMS, is an idea where you collect consent, broad informed consent, but still broad, at the moment where you collect the data and the specimen, and you start to do your secondary research projects later on without going back to that person. Well, that has very far-reaching consequences, of course, for the way we conceptualize informed consent. Actually, it means, as is visible here in this quote from the SIAMS guidelines on the storage and use of biological material and related data, that broad informed consent relies on proper governance. Whereas in the, let's say, the old paradigm, you could rely on that interaction between researcher and participant. You now have to rely on governance as well. You cannot just assume that the broad consent provides you with a justification for doing whatever you want. You really have to make sure that there are mechanisms in place that make sure that the material is used in ways that are consonant with the consent that you gave. So governance is vital. That's on the next slide. And information about that governance should be part of the informed consent process. If you collect material or data at this point and you ask the permission to use it in a later stage for purposes that you do not really know yet, then you have to have a proper governance in place in order to make sure that at that moment, the material is used for the right things that were agreed to by the participant. That should also be part of an informed consent. And mind you, I do not come across many research projects that do not at least have something of this. Even when it's, let's say, an old-fashioned project where there's a clear start and a clear ending, usually you do collect some material that you store for later use. Well, that means that those projects are actually doing two things at the same time. They have the specific informed consent for the specific purpose that you now want that person to be participating in, but they also have material and data for later use, and therefore there should also be that part about governance of how you are going to use the material in a later stage. So what I've just done is I've just added new information to the list of things to be said in the informed consent process, and therefore I've burdened the informed consent process again, which indeed leads back to that slide that we had before. Again, and I'm not claiming that this is the solution for everything, but it's clear that both in the construction of the informed consent process with respect to this broad consent part and in the governance, we should have PPI, that is patient and public involvement. It should be part of the construction and the management of the biobank, and of course also of the research done with the biobank material. And I really would like to stress that that's also implied in the word open science. Open science is big. In Europe, certainly it's big. Open science is not just publishing in open access journals. It's also being open at the beginning, open to society, listening to their needs, but also making sure that you do not just do the research. We should not leave research to researchers. Scientists should not do science on their own. They should do so in co-creation. And I think that point is clearly stressed by the iConsent project. So in conclusion, even in public health emergencies, such as we're seeing now, I think informed consent remains the cornerstone of research ethics. I really would not want to have it differently. But indeed, adaptations are necessary for several reasons. For reasons that we have not been very good in ensuring understanding in the way we've done this. iConsent provides some vital suggestions here. The practice of research is changing, but also, let's say, the context in which we do research and what research is to operate is changing. That whole open science movement is really making a fundamental change to the way that we do research. And I think the iConsent project has provided valuable guidance for a number of these so necessary adaptations. And I hope I have given you an interesting insight both into the world of research ethics and into the iConsent project. And I wish you all the luck with implementing the ideas from that project in your own research and in your own research projects. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Van Delden, for highlighting the importance that informed consent has for clinical research and the need for these adaptations that we are here today to present. Now, with all this information in mind, it's time to us to present the guidelines with the help of our partners. We would like to start off by explaining what were the challenges identified within the informed consent processes as they were when we started our investigations, and explain the relevance of the project and the guidelines. For that purpose, we've asked our colleagues from the LUMSA University to do so. Let us introduce Professor Laura Palanzani.
Hi everyone, welcome to the presentation of iConsent project. I will focus on the explanation of GAP and the relevance of a project of our guidelines on informed consent. Towards the future of informed consent in clinical research is the context of our presentation. So first of all, what is the informed consent? The informed consent for clinical trials has remained relatively unchanged for decades. And often the informed consent is considered a form that is a long and complex document, generally using technical language. It's often perceived as a sort of bureaucracy and a legal requirement. It is prepared by one stakeholder, generally is the sponsor, and the only aim is to have a document to be signed as soon as possible by the participant. That is something that has nothing to do with the ethics of the informed consent. So our project aims to outline what should be the informed consent. So we would like to start to change a sort of paradigm shift in informed consent in the way in which we think informed consent and we realize informed consent. So first of all, we would like a sort of paradigm shift from a form to a process. A process is a bidirectional communication between researchers and participants. That's an ongoing process with information that should be clear, concise, understandable, and above all, tailored to the need and the specific circumstances. Co-designed by all stakeholders, so a very inclusive, above all, on the point of view of the participants. And the aim is to ensure and empower the autonomy of the participation of the participants. So the awareness and the capacity to decide whether to participate or not, or to withdraw from participation. So this image is very clear about what we think about informed consent as a process. So from the first contact of a potential participant to the information from the side of the researcher to the participant, and above all, the point is very important of the discussion. And we think it's very important to give a lot of time for discussion and an adequate place for discussion in order to perceive all the doubts, all the questions of the participants and answer to the question. Then we need also intervention, follow up, and it could be a sort of circular process because we can go back to the discussion if it's needed till the end of the process. So what we think is very important is the feedback. So to assess the capacity to understand of a participant. So, as you know, the title of our project is Improving the Guidelines for Informed Consent, including vulnerable populations under a gender perspective. So our aim is also to tailor informed consent above all towards children, towards fertile, breastfeeding women, pregnant women, and to people coming from different religious and cultural backgrounds. So age, gender, and culture are the main points that are outlined in our project. So our project is divided in three parts. The first part is a sort of analysis of the ethical and legal framework. That's very important because, of course, our guidelines are in full accordance of with the legal documents on international, European, and national level. The second point is to identify barriers, gaps and barriers in order to overcome them for an informed consent that should be very, very inclusive, as we said before. And then the last part is to incorporate technological innovations. So what do iConsent project and iConsent guidelines add? What's the novelty of this project? So first of all, it's inclusive and it includes a broader and dynamic concept of informed consent process focused on the participants by design, co-designed by participants. Second, we have ethical recommendations in order to realize a very understandable, tailored, and inclusive informed consent. And we provide a step-by-step description in order to realize in practice this process with a checklist of what is needed. So who are these guidelines for? All stakeholders involved in the process and implementation of the informed consent process. So researchers, investigators, sponsors, and members of ethics committee who will evaluate informed consent. What is the purpose of the guidelines? They want to enhance the consent process in clinical trials, to tailor informed consent to the participants, taking into account particularly vulnerable populations, and to ensure the autonomy of the participation. Our guideline structures, the structure is divided in 4 parts. The first one is the description of a consent process, then the elaboration of specific recommendations. The second and third part are all the practical fact sheets and tools in order to realize informed consent. And the fourth part is the list of the scientific deliverables and publication of our project. So that is our guidelines. Hope you enjoy this presentation, this further presentation, and enjoy the reading and understanding of our guidelines. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Laura. Of course, we hope people enjoy the reading and the understanding of our project's final product. That said, we would like to move on to the process of elaboration of the guidelines. How did we come up with the product that we are here presenting to you today? This is very interesting, given that one of our main goals was to involve the end users. Including stakeholders in the process of elaboration of the guidelines was one of the pillars for this improvement of informed consent processes. What we did can be divided into 3 phases, although they were not consecutive. In order to explain this, we have asked our partners from Meningitis Research Foundation, the UNESCO Chair for Bioethics and Human Rights, the Bambino Gesù Children's Hospital, and the A&D Consulting Group, leaders of each task respectively, to quickly introduce us to these 3 phases. We will start off with the review of literature conducted by our partner A&D Consulting Group.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dimitris Dimitriou from A&D Consulting Group. This presentation opens a round of short presentations focusing on the elaboration process of the guidelines, a process which continued to evolve over time through regular and fruitful exchanges between consortium partners and various stakeholder groups, such as representatives from the academia, the pharmaceutical industry, patient organizations, policymakers. And the first step of this process for the elaboration of the guidelines involved that we, as a collective, as a consortium, try and put into perspective a very important yet relatively complex question. And this question was, how can the guidelines for informed consent be improved? The word improved being the key word here, as it is also suggested from the title of the project. And to understand how something can be improved, and in this particular case, how informed consent can be improved, first one needs to establish what is the baseline or what is presently considered to be common practice in the field. And then, as a next step, one needs to understand also how the scientific and empirical knowledge which has been accumulated over the years can be best utilized to address those challenges and gaps in the process, leading eventually to an improved informed consent, or at least making a step toward a new model for informed consent. Work Package 1 laid the foundations for the development of the guidelines, as it involved taking an extensive and systematic approach for the identification of existing challenges, gaps, and limitations in the informed consent process. This was a complex exercise, bearing in mind there is 2 sides to it. First, there's issues arising from different aspects of the informed consent. And second, there's challenges deriving from differences in participants' backgrounds or participants' characteristics. taking an all-round view to investigate those issues and challenges pertinent to the informed consent process, also meant that we need to move along two main axes. On the horizontal axis, we aimed at covering and bringing to the surface a wide range of issues for discussion, while on the vertical axis, we aimed at addressing those issues more in depth and in as much detail as possible. So Work Package 1 was largely based on systematic literature reviews, which unfolded in parallel over the course of 12 months. The task comprising Work Package 1, which were 7 in total, aimed at identifying methods and strategies for improving informed consent, exploring ethical and legal issues related to the informed consent process, with a particular focus on vulnerable populations. Also, we aimed at investigating age and gender-related aspects of informed consent, as well as sociocultural and interreligious perspectives on the notion of autonomy and other core principles of informed consent, with the organization of a series of workshops, which was very helpful in that time to allow us collect feedback from experts on these fields. Besides this comprehensive literature review in the context of Work Package 1, we also reviewed the major international guidelines for medical research, such as the Declaration of Helsinki, the SIOMS guidelines, the ICH guideline for good clinical practice, and we further examined the legal framework at national and EU level, particularly for women and minors participating in clinical research. The review of these documents returned many interesting findings. For instance, what constitutes relevant or adequate information in the context of information disclosure for obtaining informed consent, and further provided us with some key structural elements that we try to keep at the heart of the elaboration process of the iConsent guidelines. And one such structural element, for instance, would be the idea of informed consent representing a dynamic and continuous process, which remains a live concern for research investigators for the entire duration of the study, rather than a one-off event which finishes with the signing of a form. So I would like to close this brief presentation by saying that after completion of this comprehensive review within the first year in the project, when we finally looked back to see the wealth of information we managed to obtain, we were not only convinced at the time that guidelines for informed consent could be improved, but also felt confident about how we can achieve making this happen. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dimitris. Next step in the process was to meet some of our stakeholders and collect their insights. For that purpose, and within other activities, we organized 2 focus groups, one with patients and one with religious representatives. It was our partners from UNESCO and MRF who conducted these workshops. Please let me introduce Alberto Garcia from UNESCO Chair and Rosanna Russell from the Meningitis Research Foundation.
Good afternoon and welcome to this final event of the iConsent Consortium. This is Professor Alberto Garcia Gomez, the director of the UNESCO Chair in Bioethics and Human Rights, established at the Pontifical Atheneum Reginam Apostolorum and the Università Europea di Roma. In our consortium, we have been working hard during these 3 years toward the future of informed consent. And in our group, particularly, we focused on how to integrate the cultural and religious diversity in the process of iConsent. As you probably know, there's a lot of facts in current clinical research, and one of them is globalization of societies. And this influences also clinical research. Cultural diversity, different ethical and religious convictions are a matter of fact. in subject of experimentation and researchers belonging to different religious traditions. In iConsent, we are convinced that informed consent shouldn't be merely a form to fill up and to sign. It would be an interpersonal process where participants are conveniently accompanied and followed up by researchers and healthcare personnel with the appropriate knowledge, empathy, and virtues. Communication in this process is crucial, and cultural and religious backgrounds and perceptions matters because they condition our ways of understand our emotions and feelings. Cultural differences then between investigators and potential participants in clinical trials can result in communication barriers. Those differences are likely to hinder awareness about possible risks and benefits and therefore pose challenges to the informed consent process. That's why we have been working to suggest different guidelines in how to overcome these possible obstacles in the process. For that, we have been reading articles, books, gathering with experts from different religious traditions, with people involved in biomedical research, and there's like 5 suggestions we propose. 1, to adopt procedures that incorporate an intercultural sensitive approach, including a deep understanding and respect for people's cultural and religious backgrounds. It's a matter of fairness and equity in research participation. Second, to provide information in an easy to understand and cultural sensitive language. Third, to promote the participation of trained cross-cultural professionals in the study. 4, when feasible, to provide translators and cultural mediators familiarized with medical terminology and experienced in the relevant language, social habits, culture, traditions, religious differences. And 5, to deliver a translated informed consent form in a language and terms understandable to the participant to provide trial-related information adapted to the specific needs of the participants, their families with a different cultural background. At the very end, we suggest and we foster 3 key attitudes to adapt consent process: integrated cultural and religious diversity. 1, consciousness, being aware that key concepts can be understood differently in different religious traditions. B, empathy and sensitivity. C, proactivity, being courageous to change and adapt the consent process for the good of the patients, the participants, and for the common good. We think that by doing this, we can work toward the future of informed consent in clinical research. Thank you very much.
Hi everyone, my name is Rosanna Russell and I'm the iConsent Project Manager for the Meningitis Research Foundation. I'm going to speak a little bit about a piece of research that I was involved in alongside my colleagues at MRF to inform the development of the iConsent guidelines. I'm going to go through a few slides to talk about our involvement now. Okay, so the purpose of our research was to gather feedback from patient groups on how to improve the guidelines for informed consent within clinical trials. So in order to provide a comprehensive multi-stakeholder perspective on some of the issues surrounding informed consent, we needed to consider the needs of the patients. So in order to do this, we decided to speak to patient groups. So these are organisations which represent and advocate on behalf of their patients. And they therefore have a unique insight into the perspectives and concerns of those patients that they represent. We recruited 9 representatives from 8 patient groups based across 5 European countries to attend a one-day workshop in London to discuss the issues surrounding informed consent. And you can see the workshop in that photo there. So all patient groups were active organisations that directly represent their patients, all had a focus on meningitis, HPV, RSV, maternal or child health or healthy living, and all had English speaking capacity. So ahead of the workshop, we circulated a pre-read exercise to ensure that the attendees had at least a basic understanding of informed consent. And here we introduced 4 themes to help frame the discussion during the workshop. So the first was comprehension. So here we wanted to understand what aspects of the informed consent process are difficult for patients to understand. We also had patient expectations, so what might encourage or put some patients off taking part. Gender, so what considerations might different genders have during the consent process? And finally, children's assent. So what are the challenges of recruiting children to take part in research trials? And how does the consent process involve the child, the parent, and the researcher? So the pre-read exercise also included an example patient information sheet for an RSV vaccine trial. The workshop participants were then asked to read the information sheet and answer a short questionnaire. And this was designed to test their understanding of the document and provide an opportunity to generate thoughts on the topics being explored. And here as well, we've just posed a few questions in relation to children's assent and proposed kind of a few thoughts that either the parent, the child, or the researcher may have during the process. So within the workshop, we used a technique called nominal group to explore issues within those 4 themes and to reach a consensus in terms of their relative significance. So the stages of the nominal group technique are shown in the diagram here. So we worked through each of the 4 themes one by one following this diagram. So starting from the beginning, after we'd given an overview of the topic being discussed, we asked the participants to work individually and in silence to write down on sticky notes any issues which came to mind related to that theme. We then went into the round robin stage. So here participants took turns to read out their ideas one by one, and a sticky note was placed onto a whiteboard. Then, once all the ideas had been shared, the external workshop facilitator went through each idea on the whiteboard, and with agreement from participants, similar ideas were then grouped into sub-themes. We then moved on to the first ranking stage, where participants were asked, again working individually, to rank the sub-themes in order of importance using a ranking sheet. And then finally, all of these scores were added together, and this produced a prioritised list for each sub-theme. So here's some photos of the process. So you can see the generation of ideas on the left there with all of the sticky notes on the whiteboard, which were then placed into sub-themes in the middle photo. And then finally, each sub-theme was then ranked in order of importance on the right photo there. So we identified some key points of consensus from the workshop, which then fed into the development of the iConsent guidelines. So they were, first of all, a lack of a clear case for participation. So patient group representatives felt that informed consent documents should try to connect with patients, and they should present a clear case for participation and offer a compelling story that is relevant and meaningful to the patient. So the absence of a patient story was considered to be quite a significant barrier to participation. Too much information on risk was thought to contribute to the inability of the informed consent to really connect with patients. And this information was perceived to be more for the benefit of the sponsor to reduce their legal liability rather than for the patient. And on the converse, equipping participants with an understanding of the disease that a vaccine might offer protection against was considered very motivating. So workshop participants also talked about difficulties with trust and relationships. So here, trustworthy and clear information was considered key, not only within the consent document, but also within the communication between the researcher and the patient. The order in which information was presented was also considered to be important in establishing patient trust. So participants agreed that it would be helpful to include a statement about ethical approval at the beginning of the document to show the trial had been scrutinised by independent authorities and could therefore be trusted. And finally, we found that communication was often not appropriately tailored. Consent documents are often long and complicated, using quite a bit of technical and legal language and medical jargon, and these were considered to be barriers to comprehension. So the participants agreed that in children's assent, the scenario in which a parent and child agree and the child, parent and researcher work together was considered ideal. But family dynamics and hierarchy were acknowledged as potential barriers here. For trials relating to sexually transmitted diseases, it was felt that teenagers and parents should be able to have individual and private conversations with the researcher. Tailoring communications to the child's age and ability and testing comprehension were also considered to be really important, and it was felt that digital media could help here. Participants acknowledged that while some gender-based communication differences do exist, they're not categorical. So participants were uncomfortable about the risk of making generalizations about gendered behaviors to inform the consent process. So they suggested that communication should instead focus on connecting with and responding to the needs of patients. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening.
Thank you very much, both of you, for your explanations. The last part in the process of elaboration of the guidelines was the co-creation of materials. We reflected in the idea that if the informed consent processes were addressed to clinical research potential partners, we should definitely work with them. For this purpose, and following the concerns of the European Commission, we explored different methodologies and the possibilities offered by technology. This last task was led by Bambino Gesù Children's Hospital team. Our colleague Alberto Tozzi will explain to us a little more of how this was performed.
The process of informed consent for clinical studies does not take into account differences in people that may be willing to participate in these studies. Actually, it does not take into account differences in cultural background, in age, in perceptions, and so on. What we do most of the times is trying to prepare a simple text which is much more focused on legal problems and legal implications of informed consent, and much less about the real understanding and comprehensibility of the text for the patients willing to participate. We are actually disregarding one option, which is, in our opinion, absolutely necessary when developing an informed consent process. This option is co-creation. Nobody else than the patient and the person willing to participate in a clinical trial has a clear idea of what are their problems and how they will feel in a clinical study. And co-creation is a simple way to address all these problems. And despite that, actually, and despite the availability of different different designs for addressing this problem, we barely use this option. In iConsent, we studied in deep this possibility, and we made different workshops for patients in a hypothetical scenario in which patients, real or hypothetical patients, actually worked to actually let the investigators understand what were the feelings, and also trying to make their own option, creating their own option about the informed consent process. These workshops were absolutely exciting and provided a lot of insights. The technique that we use for this workshop is design thinking, which is a technique used in human-centered design. Design thinking has a number of steps that were reflected in the process of creating a real and a new informed consent. The first part is about understanding what the patient feels. And the very first part is understanding what they feel, they say, they think, and they do. This is about an empathy map, which is the very first step of the process of design thinking. Once understood what are the implications and the perceptions of the patients, it's very easy to go to a second step, which is discussing the potential solutions that may address the barriers or the problems and the issues coming out from this simple step. So understanding the journey of the patient during the informed consent is an option which provides a lot of insights. But it's not only understanding the patients. Once we discuss with them which kind of options we can use for getting better in the informed consent, we come out with completely different informed consent process, not only because the information is provided in different ways, but also because the journey through the informed consent is different and actually is more tailored to the needs of patients willing to participate. Once actually we discussed all the barriers and tried to address them through different techniques and also with different type of explanations provided in the text. We also asked the participants in the workshop to work on the possibility of creating a novel process of informed consent and creating a prototype which is not only text, not only content, but also a wireframe of how the information provided during the informed consent process may be available to patients. And given the availability of so many actually easy technical facilities, we asked the patients to provide suggestions about the use of digital techniques, the web, the use of smartphones, and so on. And the prototypes that actually we created during these workshops were absolutely brilliant. And one of the perceptions that we had actually looking at these prototypes was we could never have developed something like this without working together with patients. Once actually we ended up with the prototypes, we realized that actually co-creation through design thinking or other human-centered design techniques is a powerful option for creating informed consent processes that are extremely valuable and have the potential to improve the understanding of the content of the informed consent for patients willing to participate, and also improving the acceptability, because when people and patients understand, they are not scared, they do not have fear, and actually it's much more easy to take an informed decision.
Thank you, Alberto, and the rest of the team for describing the process followed to create the guidelines for tailoring the informed consent process in clinical studies. We are all now excited to know about these guidelines. Jaime Fons, the project scientific coordinator from Fisabio, will give us a sip of the guidelines, the most important and attractive areas developed by the consortium.
Thank you, Javier, for your presentation. Thank you to all partners who have already explained the elaboration process of the guidelines. Thank you to the rest of the speakers that participate in this final event. And of course, thank you to all the attendees who are now online. The guidelines for tailoring the informed consent process in clinical studies highlights two ideas. On one hand, the importance of having the participant in the center, incorporating their point of view in every step, starting from the design of the consent. On the other hand, it is a step forward to develop the process of the informed consent, as the informed consent is not only the signature of a document, but a process. In fact, iConsent considers the informed consent process should be a continuous bidirectional communication process that begins in the first contact with the potential participant and continues until the end of the study. The title also has some bearing on the scope of the guidelines, as there are only for informed consent processes for clinical research, not for clinical practice. These guidelines have been elaborated to complement the already existing legislation and guidelines, such as the CIOMS. Therefore, the guidelines for tailoring the informed consent process in clinical studies should be read in conjunction with these documents. You may be wondering, what are these guidelines for? Who are these guidelines for? What are the scope and limitations of these guidelines? What makes these guidelines special? What will I find in the guidelines? Have these guidelines been validated? Is there an example of informative materials developed following the guidelines? Let's answer this question. Let's start by the first one. What are these guidelines for? The guidelines aim to make the consent process more comprehensive, tailored to participants' needs, preferences, and circumstances, and inclusive. They will assist the investigator, for instance, in the device of the information materials, of the thank you letter, or in the summary of results, among others. This will contribute to ensure that individuals can make autonomous decisions about their participation in clinical research and their health. Who are these guidelines for? We have envisioned these guidelines to help all stakeholders involved in the design, evaluation, and implementation of the consent process, including sponsors, investigators, and also of the ethics committees involved in the evaluation and approval of consent materials. What are the scope and limitation of these guidelines? The limitation of the guidelines come mostly from its scope. As already mentioned, these guidelines are focused on the clinical research and do not deal with the issues related to informed consent in clinical practice. From all the aspects dealing with inclusion, the iConsent choose to address age, gender, multiculturality, and vulnerability. Even so, there are some limitations to our analysis. In case of age, only recommendations about the study with minors have been included. About gender has been understood as the psychological, social, and cultural dimensions that influence men and women's behavior and roles. It has not been understood as the range of identities that do not correspond to established ideas of male and female. About multiculturalism, recommendations are focused on religion, linguistic, and/or cultural origin differences. About vulnerable population, we included the recommendations that could arise from the situations already mentioned above, and recommendations about low-income populations. Recommendations on the informed consent process for biobanks and during pandemic situations have been addressed only briefly, with one fact sheet about each one. The use of new technologies has mainly focused on how to improve understanding and tailor the informed consent process to the preferences and needs of potential participants. What makes these guidelines special? What makes them special is that they represent a change in the mindset, which gives greater prominence to informed consent, turning it into a process that provides added value and prevents it from becoming a bureaucratic act focused solely on the participant's signature on the informed consent form. This informed consent process, as you can see in the figure, is a 5-step process that goes from the participants' first contact with the study and continues until the end of the study. The guidelines also considers involving potential participants during the design, elaboration, and evaluation of the informed consent materials as the key element to improve them. Also, it's important to get their feedback during and after the study. The guidelines also consider information materials as key and the main information source. Many informed consent in clinical research are long and difficult to follow by a large majority of the non-medical population, and the decision to participate or not is mainly based on the discussions with the investigator. Therefore, there is a need to improve the understanding of the study and let the discussion with the investigator to resolve doubts and also to check that the participant actually understands the study. Other thing that makes this guideline special is that the recommendations included are more specific and practical than in most guidelines about informed consent. What will I find in the guidelines? These guidelines are divided in 4 parts: consent as a process, checklist for investigators designing a consent process, fact sheet and tools, and list of I-consent scientific deliverables and publications. About the consent as a process. This part highlights the importance of understanding the process as a whole, rather than only focusing on the participant's signature on the form. It explains the informed consent process step by step and provides recommendations for each step. It also includes recommendations to design an informed consent process with study populations to meet their preferences and needs. Following this idea, in the design of the consent materials, they will have 3 key points. Understand your target population by using this interdisciplinary quantitative and qualitative methodologies to learn about your study population, their interests and needs. Use co-design as central concept, co-creating the consent by designing, developing, and reviewing consent with a diverse sample of potential participants. And these both things will give as result consent materials that better suit potential participants' needs and preferences. These materials should provide clear and concise information and be inclusive. To meet individual preferences and needs, the face-to-face discussion with the investigator is key. But some recommendations, such as using a layered approach for presenting information and providing different channels and formats to receive information or communicating with the research team, will be also very useful. The guidelines also provide specific recommendations for the informed consent. The guidelines give some recommendations and key ideas to take into account when the study involves minors, fertile, pregnant, or breastfeeding women, participants coming from different cultural and religious backgrounds, and low-income populations. The guidelines also include recommendations to apply a gender perspective. They analyze the concept of gender and its influence in clinical studies and give some recommendations to apply a gender perspective. Recommendations are mainly focused on the elaboration of materials and the communication during the informed consent process. These recommendations are aimed at reducing the health inequalities arising from informed consent processes in medical research, such as a study that do not take into account women needs, studies where women are underrepresented, or situations where they suffer more coercion during decision-making, and to make materials and the informed consent process as inclusive as possible. The checklist for investigators designing a consent process. This checklist is a practical tool that aims to help investigators and organizations in fulfilling the requirements of regulatory, funding, and other bodies, but also to identify and review all the key aspects that need to be covered in the consent process to make it more understandable and to meet the needs and preferences of potential participants. Fact sheets and tools. The third part of the guidelines provide a series of easy to read and ready to use fact sheets and tools that complement the core document, highlight the importance of several aspects of the informed consent process, and provide recommendations on how to implement best practices. It includes 12 factsheets and 5 tools that highlight the different factors involved in the informed consent process and provide recommendations on how to implement best practices. The factsheets delve into aspects directly related to the informed consent process, such as how to present information, how to advertise the study, how to assess participants' comprehension, or the use of decision aids. The tools include aspects that do not strictly pertain to the informed consent process, but are useful for its better development, such as how to improve communication skills, prepare a thank you letter, or methodologies for incorporating the participant's perspective. About the list of recommendations, scientific deliverables, and publications, this last section contains a list of public deliverables and publications prepared in the framework of the iConsent project, with links to each publication. These publications have been used to produce the guidelines. This list is going to continue growing after the publication of the guidelines, so we recommend to continue visiting the project website. Have these guidelines been validated? The recommendations proposed in the guidelines have been validated at different levels. First, the appropriateness of the main recommendations of the guidelines were analyzed and assessed, especially the most innovative ones, using a RAND-UCLA methodology. That is a modification of Adelphi. The evaluation panel was composed of representatives of patients, researchers, experts in ethics, pharmaceutical industry, and policymakers. During this process, most of the recommendations made in the guidelines were considered appropriate, and none of them were considered inappropriate. To validate the recommendations in target population following the guidelines, information materials were prepared for 3 hypothetical clinical trials with vaccines. Each one was addressed to a different population: children, pregnant women, and adults. These materials were tested in 3 different countries: Spain, Romania, and UK. Since these were not really clinical, they were not real clinical trials, only the recommendations for the development of information materials were taken into account within the informed consent process. Finally, as a culmination of the project, the patient information materials for a real clinical trial, the VIGIRA study, were prepared following the guidelines. These clinical trial studies measures the effect of the influenza vaccines in the children aged between 12 and 35 months during the 2019 and 2020 influenza season. The materials were designed with and for parents of children who could potentially participate in the study. Is there an example of informative materials developed following the guidelines? Yes. In the following link that you have there, http://iconsent.pilotvalidation.eu, you can find the information materials prepared for the 3 hypothetical study cases used for the validation: the minors, pregnant women, and adults. For the minors, a website and a video was prepared. For pregnant women, a website and a video and some infographics. In the case of adults, a website including some infographics. I want to finish my intervention showing one of them to you. In this case, I'm going to show the one, let me see. This is the website where you can find it. You have it in 3 different languages: Spanish, English, that is the one that is now, and Romanian. Okay, you have here the 3 case studies that we did: Janssen study, pregnancy study, and adult study. Okay. In this case, I'm going to show you the one of minors, the study with minors. Okay. As you can see here, the first thing we did was to give 3 different formats for the people who wanted to participate in this study. So they could get information in a document, in a video, or through the website, okay? In the case of the document, as you can see, this document has been improved to be more attractive, and also it has some special parts where you can find additional explanation. That what does is similar to the layer approach in the website, as I'm going to show you now, okay? The video, it was a short video that was done as a storytelling.
Hello,
okay?
I'm Paul, the doctor in charge of this research project. I became a doctor.
If you want, you can go to the website and see it, okay? And in the case of the website, as you can see, we use a layer approach where the person can decide to go in deep to some information to get additional information about definitions or things like that. For example, if the person doesn't know what a placebo is, there is a definition about it, okay? What a blood test is. You can see it here. Or about the participation, if it's mandatory, what happens. Okay, so as you can see, this website is a lot more attractive from our point of view than the traditional informed consent form. And to arrive to this material, previous findings of the project were used, and we did a review of the literature to identify children's preferences and interests in relation to informed consent and clinical trials. We also identified the concepts and parts that were usually not well understood. And in addition, we did 2 design thinking sessions, one with children and their parents, where we explained them through a role play what a clinical trial and informed consent are. We presented different formats to deliver the information as text, video, comic, infographics to them, and we explore their opinion and about these formats and their preferences. And finally, they prototype a video explaining a clinical trial, while their parents prototype an infographic to explain the procedures of a clinical trial. During the second design thinking session with the children, the text of an informed consent form was analyzed, exploring their preferences about the wording and editing, the order of the information, and identifying parts that were difficult to understand. Participants also made some definitions of difficult to understand concepts, including some explanatory draws. Finally, a session was held with minors to pilot the information materials, where we saw them this website and a survey that was going to be used during the validation. Changes were suggested for the final version, and we applied them. Okay, thank you so much for your attention. And I will be ready if you have later any question to discuss. Okay, thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much, Jaime. This was very illustrating, and we hope it intrigues the attendees to check the full version of it. Now that you have met our guidelines, we would like to present some additional project products, including the challenges and adaptations presented by COVID-19. No need to say that this event is being held virtually. For this purpose, we've asked our pharma partners, GSK, to introduce them.
Good evening, everyone. We're so happy to be here in our final event. And we want to share with you this section called Other Project Products, which include a flavor of key practical tools that we have created in the project with the aim of facilitating the comprehension of informed consent to participants and also supporting the researchers. First of all, the first product that we would like to present, it's called Evaluation Protocol for Informed Consent, EPIC tool, which is a stepwise and practical approach that can be applied across the different steps of informed consent process since the first contact with the participant until the study end. And particularly, this tool gives support to less experienced researchers. It comprises a series of checklists in each of the steps of the informed consent process, and this checklist evaluate 4 key elements, which are information disclosure, understanding, decision capacity, and voluntariness. This tool was also tested and was received very positively with the health professionals with expertise in the field of clinical research, and it achieved its primary objective, which is the early identification of weaknesses, gaps, and risks in the informed consent process.
Yeah, iConsent has also been working in mitigating the impact of COVID-19 pandemic. Clinical research plays a crucial role in countering the pandemic. The need to speed up research and get results soon while having patients in serious clinical conditions make it difficult to obtain informed consent, which, however, remains an essential ethical requirement. We can perceive the importance of understanding the risks and uncertainties, along with the potential benefits of undergoing a clinical trial for a COVID-19 treatment. It is for this reason that the iConsent Consortium has also focused on the informed consent in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. LUMSA University held internal meetings with key experts on how to deal with informed consent in this context and published the conclusions. LUMSA also worked in an article that will be published on the BioLaw Journal, special issue on informed consent during pandemic. That is, the number is coming in spring. The iConsent guidelines will include a fact sheet with specific recommendations for the informed consent and COVID-19 clinical trials. Finally, the iConsent Consortium has made an effort to improve communication around the pandemic, for example, creating a glossary of terms that explain the meaning of words which were unknown to the general public, for example, airborne transmissions or epidemic curve, and also sharing tools to help the health professionals on how to better communicate with the society in a health emergency crisis and how to tailor this health information to our audience.
Well, finally, the last product created here was a video about clinical trials in vaccines. The idea of this video was first, to enhance comprehension of the vaccines development and manufacturing process. Second, to illustrate and explain the different phases of clinical development in humans. And third, emphasize and highlight the key elements of the informed consent form process. So this means voluntariness, autonomy, freedom, and privacy. We do believe that now more than ever, struggling with such noise and misinformation in the media, this video and the intention is to bring light and clarity to our population. So thank you very much, and let's watch the video.
Clinical trials for vaccines. Clinical vaccine trials are studies performed in people that aims to evaluate if a vaccine is safe and works. What should you know before choosing to participate in a clinical trial? Clinical trials are designed and conducted by health professionals and researchers and reviewed and approved by an independent ethics committee and the health authority. Before enrolling in a clinical trial, the informed consent process is conducted. And what is informed consent? During the informed consent process, a researcher explains the clinical trial and clarifies anything that is not understood. If after considering all of the information, you decide to participate, then you will have to sign an informed consent form. During the informed consent process, benefits will be explained as well as any possible adverse events. These events could include side effects like headache, fever, or injection site tenderness, etc. Participation in clinical trials is completely voluntary, and if you do decide to start a trial, you can always decide to withdraw without giving any explanation. Several study visits will be scheduled for you if you agree to participate in a trial. These include medical checkups, like blood tests to see how your body reacts to the vaccine. You will also have to give information about your health by telephone and fill in a diary. It is important that you do not forget to report any harm or pain that you might feel during the trial. Your medical and personal information will be kept confidential, private, and safe by using a code number instead of your name. What are vaccines? Vaccines are biological products which are given to a large number of people around the world. Vaccines teach the body how to defend itself from virus or bacteria that cause particular diseases. Vaccination is one of the most effective ways to prevent diseases. How can we develop a vaccine? Vaccine development is a long and complex process. It starts with research in the laboratory. Next, tests are conducted in people. Finally, if a vaccine is considered safe and effective enough, it can go to market. This process can take more than 10 years. Although in health emergencies, the process can be sped up to have the vaccine available as quickly as possible. Every vaccine undergoes extensive safety evaluations during the whole trial and even after having gone to market and been distributed. In the laboratory, researchers extract a piece of the germ that the body's immune response can recognize. This recognizable piece is known as an antigen and is used when making vaccines. When a vaccine is first made, it is tested in animals. Once the vaccine has shown that it works in animals, it is considered for testing in humans, human clinical trials. Human clinical trials are divided into 4 steps, called phases. Each phase has a different goal. Phase 1. The vaccine is studied for the first time on a small group of people, 20 to 80, to evaluate its safety and side effects. Phase 2. If the vaccine seems safe enough from the results from Phase 1, it is then given to a bigger group of people, more than 100, in Phase 2. This helps researchers to study its safety and effectiveness in more detail. Phase 3. Vaccines that are considered safe and effective enough in Phase 2 move into Phase 3. Here, the vaccine is given to thousands of people around the world to confirm how safe and effective the vaccine is in different people. It also helps researchers compare effects to other vaccines that are available, or against a placebo. We will explain what a placebo is later on. If everything goes well in Phase 3, researchers will request approval for the vaccine to be available on the market. Phase 4. After its market approval by regulatory organizations, vaccine safety and efficacy are further monitored in the wider community. This involves following any side effects that occur. By monitoring millions of people over a long time, it is possible to detect any side effects that may happen over time. In order to test if a vaccine works, the researchers will compare it with a placebo or another vaccine. Participants are put into a group randomly, and in some trials, neither the participants nor the researchers know who is receiving each treatment. What is a placebo? A placebo is something that's given to a patient that has no effect on your body. For example, a saline injection. This is given because sometimes just thinking that you have received the vaccine can lead to some effects, like reporting certain symptoms that you may not otherwise notice. Remember, vaccine development is a long and complex process and can take more than 10 years. The step you are considering taking is really important because by testing this trial vaccine, the research team and scientists can learn if it can be used to benefit other people in the future, improving public health and social welfare. The benefits of the vaccine should always outweigh the risks.
Thank you, Maria, Olga, and Reyes, for introducing the other project products. which are equally important and may help investigators in their task of developing the informed consent, at least in the vaccine areas. And now it's time for the open discussion, for the debate, and to solve those, if any, of course. Let's do it.